So I had psychic experiences, or let's say psychic or experiences of a spiritual nature, going back to when I was really young. So to report that, and that experience essentially kind of showed me very clearly that okay, there's this like other person or discrete entity separate from me who seems to be communicating to me, and I can relay this information, and that information can be confirmed by some of the
Sereni.
family.
Gabriel Sereni is an experienced medium, healer, intuitive coach, and teacher with over 20 years of experience in the transformation space. He is also incredibly knowledgeable on the science and scientific research into consciousness and altered states of
As a
consciousness.
medium, when I get information through my mediumship coming from someone else, let's say like on the other side or who's non-physical, the information will usually have a charge to it. I feel like it has kind of a presence and a charge to the way that information feels and the way I perceive
Hey
it.
everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality.
Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking with medium and healer Gabriel Sereni, and he also has a vast body of knowledge of many fascinating aspects and areas of this topic. So welcome, Gabriel.
Welcome. Thank you, Liz, for having me on. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate your being here. So first of all, can you let us know, when did you first realize you had abilities?
Yeah, so I had psychic experiences, or let's say psychic or experiences of a spiritual nature, going back to when I was really young. So to really probably the earliest I can remember, which is at least with detail, which is around the age of 4 to 5. However, I really had my first mediumship type of experience. It showed me I had psychic mediumship capacities, maybe in the more classic sense that we kind of understand, like being able to communicate with somebody who's crossed over and provide that information to someone. And that actually happened back in 2003. So, fortunately, I'm getting older here, but I was in my early 20s then, and so that was an experience where I essentially was with a group of family members, and we were kind of talking about these kinds of topics, and essentially somebody started to come through, and I started to report that, and that experience essentially kind of showed me very clearly that okay, there's this like other person or discrete entity separate from me who seems to be communicating to me, and I can relay this information, and that information can be confirmed by some of the family. And this was, somebody who I didn't know, that was connected to, my spouse's cousin's father. And so, and I was getting details like, a surfboard and things like this that I didn't know what they meant, but the family was able to confirm, and they were quite shocked and surprised. So that was probably my first experience showing me I had those abilities.
What were your thoughts about those abilities beforehand? Was this something you were really open to, or did it just hit you as this complete shock?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was a little bit shocked because I think in my mind, up until that point, I thought that I had to have certain abilities developed to be able to do that, and I just didn't really see myself having those abilities at that time. I had had psychic and spiritual experiences up to that point, namely like in the lucid dreaming area, astral projection area. I had been meditating, so I had had a number of kind of like psi related experiences up to that point, but nothing like that in regards to mediumship. That for me was a little bit out of, sort of out of the blue, because it wasn't something I was trying to pursue actually, or really trying to do, and I hadn't really studied it formally in any sense, except for more reading about the topic, and then maybe having some moments maybe where, in teaching classes, whether it be meditation or other topics, I had sometimes wondered if somebody was helping me in sometimes my teaching experiences. Like I'd get a certain series of thoughts that didn't feel like my own, but I didn't really identify it clearly as being, okay, this is definitely mediumship, or maybe I suspected it could be, but I really wasn't sure. So it wasn't in that sense like in the experience that happened.
So when you would get these thoughts that didn't feel like your own, what exactly do you mean by that? Did it feel physiologically different than normal thoughts? How was the experience?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to look at that, because I think the answer is, of course, going to be different between different mediums or psychics, or at least people practicing in the space. For me, I could say back then in that particular experience, but also in experiences since, I had kind of a perception. So there's a few things I think I want to mention here, Liz, which is, first off, you kind of have like your baseline of perceptions. So you kind of know, okay, I have emotions within this range. My thoughts kind of are experienced by myself in this manner. Like they kind of seem a certain way. Maybe they have a kind of certain speed to them, a kind of qualitative nature. Maybe if we look at the phenomenology of them, and within that sort of baseline range, what happened during the mediumship experience is like I kind of went outside of those bounds, where all of a sudden I kind of felt like I was me, but something was different. And I think in retrospect, I was experiencing what it was like to be sort of connected or blended to this other consciousness or spirit. And for me, I'm quite energetically sensitive, and was from a young age, but also as I developed myself, that also increased. But what I didn't really know, I think at that time, but I know now as a professional medium, that I was essentially having some kind of auric blend or process whereby I'm starting to feel what that consciousness or spirit's actually feeling, but including maybe the way their body might have felt or the way their emotions felt. And so it's a little bit like you have a set of sensations and something like a filter gets overlaid on it. And now it's like, oh, wow, I just feel a bit different here. Some of it's hard to describe. It's a little bit like if I were to ask you, okay, describe the difference between blue and green. It's kind of hard for people to describe that, because it's like really kind of like, you think of like qualia in psychology, right? Where it's like, there's a what it's like to it. We definitely know that difference, right? For those of us that are not colorblind, but it's actually, it's hard to put into words. But the distinction is pretty clear, right? At least visually in this example. So for me, that's really what it was like. And I did notice, like with my thoughts, I would say that the thoughts felt different overall, the whole category of thoughts. And I experienced this as a medium too. And they sort of come laced with a different emotion or a sentiment. But I would say it's kind of something more subtle, a little bit like you're picking up more the baseline pattern of that particular person. Just like you might meet somebody in a room and you get a vibe from them, and it's kind of hard to describe, right? But that vibe kind of indicates, a feeling you get, and you could maybe recognize that again. If that person were with you, you might perceive that feeling, if you will. So yeah, that's some of the things I've noticed. I can go into more detail about that too.
Sure. Well, first I'm going to ask you, you said it sort of would feel like a vibe from them,
Yeah.
similar to when you feel a person. Do you feel a difference? Like if a friend walks into the room, or a stranger or someone, does it feel different, the vibe you get from a living person, than the vibe you get from someone on the other side?
Yeah, so there is definitely overlap to me. I would say, to kind of go a little bit further into that, Liz, if you think of the vibe you might get from a living person, there's kind of like a felt sense of presence in one's body that you might feel. And some people might feel that more in terms of the feeling sense or like emotion. Some people might have a different sense of how they feel in their body, that kind of embodied sense, if you will. I think there's some overlap between the two, between living people and people on the other side, or people that have crossed over. I will say one difference is that I tend to feel the whole process and that connection, that vibe, if you will, with someone who's crossed over. In terms of energetics, is probably the best way I'd describe it. Like I'm perceiving energy in a visceral, kinesthetic sense, and that could be like, for example, somebody is to my side and I'm feeling as if someone's standing to my side, but it doesn't feel like a physical body. It feels like a sort of energetic overlay that I might relate to my bodily sensations in terms of like my sense of being in my body. But now something feels like it's three-dimensionally taking some kind of space or is sharing the space with me. So I think that's a difference, a notable difference, that you feel, because obviously, like, when you're connecting to somebody physically, they're not going to be like merging into your body, or you have a sense of distance, separation, and certain things kind of that are there. And those things kind of collapse a bit when we're talking about connecting to, people on the other side, at least in my experience.
Well, also, and I this is sort of a spin-off of what I just asked, but so there's psychic information versus mediumship information. Now, first of all, can you explain the difference to our listeners, and then the physiological difference for you if you're actually not just around a living person, but reading them psychically?
Okay. So let's start off, I guess, with the difference between psychic and mediumship. I would define that as the following. So, in a nutshell, most people in this space, most psychics and mediums, as well as myself, would probably define the difference as being that psychics are obtaining information about the person through their psychic senses or psychic faculties. And then mediums are gaining information or obtaining information through another, living entity, or this is either like on the other side and maybe some other dimension, right, of some sort. So the idea is like psychics are using their psychic faculties, and mediums are, connecting with, non-physical entities and gaining information from them somehow. I do think in practice some of this is kind of blended. So although, one popular saying you'll find in the space is that all mediums are psychic, but not all psychics are mediums. And that makes sense to me, but I do think probably in practice, most psychics probably do experience aspects of mediumship here and there, even if they're not aware of it and they're not identifying it as such. So it would be easy for someone, for example, I think in some circumstances, to confuse a psychic perception as being just, a piece of information coming from like a person, a discarnate entity or being, as their own psychic perception. If they're not aware of those differences, or they're just simply given the way they're kind of experiencing it. So this kind of gets into like unconscious channeling or unconscious mediumship. And I think that a lot of people in society probably experience this and just have no idea that they're experiencing mediumship. And I'm sure, people that, especially, people that were like, let's say, great communicators in history, or certain kinds of people in certain maybe vocations or lines of work, that, they could experience the help, for example, of someone we might define as a spirit guide or a spirit helper of some sort, and just not know that they're getting information, or there's some kind of interaction going on, because they're just unaware of that space, and they don't need to be to receive that information necessarily.
And do you think, oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I was going to say, and Liz, there's probably a few things I can also kind of break down a little bit in terms of the way the psychic information comes versus the mediumistic information.
Yes.
One thing I'll say is, I think that for me as a medium, when I get information through my mediumship coming from someone else, let's say like on the other side, or who's non-physical, the information will usually have a charge to it. I feel like it has kind of a presence and a charge to the way that information feels and the way I perceive it. Whereas if I'm using my own psychic faculties, I don't feel that charge. It kind of just feels like me and myself. It's more contained to my own energy, and I don't notice any kind of other foreign energy or more extreme shift to my own energy field, kind of in the way that it comes. So that would be one way I'd kind of differentiate the way it might be experienced. Um, and you also get a sense of a personality at times when the information's coming from someone else. And that doesn't mean a personality like somebody who's shy versus confident or that sort of thing, but simply a sense that there's an intelligence behind this, perhaps with intent. So you might get information around that coming with the information that you're getting, versus like if you're just psychically reading somebody. But practically speaking, in a reading, they can kind of go hand in hand, and I feel like they kind of rely most readings. Even if many psychic mediums are thinking, okay, I'm just providing this from the spirit world, this information, none of this is coming from me. That's unlikely, because in my experience, I've also noticed that, what we call spirit guides or spirit helpers in the mediumship process will utilize our psychic faculties to sometimes bring us information or show us something as part of the reading or part of whatever session is taking place, like let's say with healing or things like that too. So.
No, I just want to back up on 2 points. First of all, you said there are a lot of people you think who get mediumistic information and don't know it. Do you think that's all of us? Like, for example, I suddenly have, for some reason, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go out Friday and stay home Saturday when I was debating, and just something will randomly pop in my head. Then I go out Friday and meet like an amazing job lead or the love of my life. And it was really like my dad saying, Liz, go, go. Do you, because I have had experiences like that where I just sort of did things and didn't know why. For example, my listeners will know one I've talked about a bit on here, when I was motivated for some reason, almost an argument in my head, to text my good friend and medium, Joe Peretta. The details of this are in my book, my second book that's about to come out, and it led to this kind of crazy sign. So that's just one small kind of experiment and experience related to it. So is it like that where just all of us are?
So I'm not sure as to the exact amount of people, but I'm going to take a guess that it's very prevalent, particularly probably with people that are empathic or more sensitive. And based on research in parapsychology, and people who exhibit psi, for example, are going to be also more likely to potentially have spontaneous unconscious mediumship experiences. I think because some of the same mechanisms could be at play. The same thing that allows them to have psychic experiences in one area is going to, in some cases, be connected to how they can have psychic experiences in another. So someone who's very intuitive is going to be more likely to probably be also mediumistic, if we want to use that word. Now, I don't know if it's everybody, but my guess is a large portion of the population. I mean, if we take the United States, right, with hundreds of millions of people, I'm sure it's in the many, many millions that have had, experiences like that. Now, I don't know if maybe a person on average has one of those in their lifetime, somebody who doesn't work in the space or has no interest in the space. That I'm not sure about. I think that depends on what you're doing and, again, your sensitivity. I think most of the block to perceiving things that are coming through our natural mediumship faculties tends to be on our side. I don't see much of it being on the spirit side or the non-physical side. I think that that's my personal opinion. I think in most cases we're the block to it. Not so much that the problem's on their side, trying to get the information across. So that's something to kind of bear in mind, I think, too, looking at this topic.
Now, when you're giving medium readings, how do you know you're actually making contact with a specific deceased loved one? Like, how do you actually know it's them?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I think it's important to ask for people that are also looking to connect with loved ones that are maybe not going through a professional medium. But there's a couple of things that come to mind here. So as a professional medium, when I am connecting to, let's say, someone's deceased relative or somebody else non-physical, I will have a certain set of cues that I have to kind of see in place to make sure that I can verify that. So the first thing is, when I do a mediumship session, I often will work from my perception. It seems I'm working in the presence of a spirit guide or helper, spirit helper of some sort, that helps to coordinate or manage those sessions. They get involved with helping to facilitate the process. And so I won't give a reading unless I perceive that connection. Um, and I have it, like, just, practicing as a student, I have, and sometimes you can have like someone come through who's just like maybe randomly floating into the room. I'm not really sure, like, why they're there, but it might be somebody completely not connected to the sitter or the person you're giving a reading for. So I will have certain things in place like that, and then I also have to ensure that I have certain energetic perceptions that also act as cues to kind of help me to verify or to know that, okay, the quality of this connection is of a certain amount and that I can trust what's coming through this channel. And so another cue is that I feel that sense of presence we were talking about before. And I feel it, for me, I'm quite sensitive in the kind of like bodily, visceral, kinesthetic sense. Like, I can feel if like there's a presence to my right or to my left or behind me or in front. And this is just due to years of training with energy-based meditations and other practices. And so I have to perceive some of that to ensure that, okay, there's someone here. I do have connections sometimes with non-physical entities where I don't sense that, and I don't even get a visual cue, and they seem to be kind of like a point of light, maybe, or I see something kind of in my clairvoyance. But um, I will have still, even if it's more subtle, I'll still have that sense of presence, and there's like a charge to the energy, and there's intention behind it, So yeah, so those are things that I have to have as cues. Now, I do think there's a couple of things here, Liz. I think mediums that are in training, you have to do proper training to be able to reality test if what you're getting is actually coming from, a non-physical being. And if so, if that information, right, let's say in the case of evidential mediumship, is evidential. I think if you're at home trying to connect to a relative and maybe you're doing a set of practices, you should reality test the sort of the information coming. Or like, if I have a sense of presence and I'm getting an idea. Okay, so you have something coming through your mediumship, but okay, but how can you trust that? Like, how do you really know that that's like your dad, or how do you know that that's your aunt, or whomever you think it might be? I think it's good to reality test that information by asking them to provide something, maybe that could be evidential in nature, but also testing it over time, to see, because we have to remember we are putting a burden on them the moment we're asking them to provide evidence. It's not like everybody dies as an expert in being someone on the other side coming through medium. So, there's some considerations there, I think. But yeah, those are some thoughts that kind of come to mind.
I just have a question based on what you said, that not everyone's an expert at coming through. Are some people who've passed much better at coming through? And for example, are people who've maybe worked in this world here or were mediums or researchers, are they much better at making communication than maybe someone who didn't believe this at all?
Yeah, so based on my observations over the years, both from my astral projection or out of body experiences as well as my mediumship experiences, I would say that some are better communicators than others, for sure. Um, and I have had, I'll just provide some examples here, Liz. Like, I've had some sessions with clients where I seem to be receiving information from the person who's crossed over directly. I've also had situations where someone comes into the session, and from what I can perceive, they seem to be in some kind of like healing process, or they seem to be in a state where they can't readily communicate within the mediumship process between the sitter, the medium, and let's say themselves. And I have seen guides or helpers get involved. I'm going to use helpers as a term here interchangeably with spirit guides, because I'm not always a fan of the spirit guide term, but they will sometimes, they'll help facilitate that communication. And I've seen them kind of blend. I've clairvoyantly seen them blend with people like who have crossed over, and actually kind of help to deliver that message to me as the medium. And my sense is, because without that blend or without that help from the spirit guide, the communication might not be as clear, or it might be more patchy for me as a medium. And again, I can always improve as a medium, as all mediums I think can, but I do think they intervene sometimes to kind of help that, which to me shows that, yeah, some are not as good communicators. And I've also had some people that were, really able to communicate very little, because I think they were still adapting to having died. and are almost a little bit in a shock state, and maybe not ready to come through with much information, um, or they're not very lucid or not very aware. So I've had a few cases like that that I've seen. Now, I think in terms of that aspect you asked, like would mediums, for example, be better, or let's say researchers, I do think there is a direct correlation between your awareness and your consciousness here, and then when you cross over, you bring degrees of awareness with you. It doesn't mean that you cross over and all of a sudden you become enlightened. You tend to kind of stay within a range of your consciousness and awareness in this life. And so, yes, you might be a more lucid version of yourself. You might be, more like sharper in your thinking, or you might have certain faculties that you didn't have when you were alive. But it's going to be within a certain kind of range, generally. And so, if you were a good communicator, if you were not afraid of death, and aware, I don't think it's a far stretch to take a guess that you'll probably be better at communicating. There's a possibility to be better at communicating. But again, I think a lot of this has to do with the medium. When we talked about this, practically speaking, in terms of the information coming through. So
now, in all of your readings, and we'll bring in astral projection, all of it, what is the most evidential experience you've ever had?
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this, Liz, and it's hard for me to come up with one. And the reason being is because I kind of think of evidential information as, you could think of it as sort of a singular piece of information that just is so statistically improbable, right, for someone to know. So let's just say, if someone came through with someone's social security number, right, that would be a very good piece of evidential information, right? Or let's say a telephone number. But you also have what I would call a compounding effect when we look at evidential mediumship, where the evidential component of the reading and the strength of that evidential component is based on this compounding of various pieces of information coming through, that when you stack them together, just becomes very, very improbable to have all of that information in one place. So I would say that probably most of my readings, that are let's say the ones I can think of that are most evidential in nature, there was probably more of a compounding effect. And there's quite a few I could bring here. I mean, one example that comes to mind was I had two sisters that sat with me for a reading. I didn't know who they were. And this was actually at one of those expos, which I really wasn't sure what to expect. I kind of went there because I was just starting as a medium and I wanted to gain experience and just have the experience of going there. And they came for a reading and I didn't know who they were. And essentially, so in a nutshell, their father came through, and I ended up getting like his the first initial of his name, the fact that I saw him clairvoyantly. It looked to me like he was on a ranch, like sitting on a ranch with his brother, and I knew his brother was very close to him. And I talked a little bit to them about the nature of that relationship and how he was kind of communicating to me in the mediumship session. It's like a little bit like connecting with somebody who's in some kind of astral realm, if we want to use that term, but in a place where they feel safe and comfortable. And this ranch, he said that this ranch was kind of like his dream ranch. And he was explaining to his girls that, and they knew what I was talking about. They knew what he was talking about. So I had details like this came through. He showed me a photograph in the same session too that was from his childhood with a toy horse. They didn't know what I was talking about or what he was bringing through in the session. And then later they went through the photo album and they found this photo that matched that description exactly. And they called me up. One of them called me up and told me, Gabe, you're not going to believe this, but we found the photo that he was referring to. So that was really quite interesting. And then he also started to describe very specific situations about his daughters. Like he brought up the fact that one of them was having problems at her job and facing kind of a career crisis, if you will, and talked about their mom, who had not crossed over, but was experiencing a lot of issues. So at the time, personal and emotional issues. And, I could give more details here, Liz. I also want to make sure.
Yeah, I think that's really good details. The picture. Yeah. And
so that would be an example, that kind of compounding, right, of those different elements. Yeah.
And kind of along the same lines, but doesn't have to be evidential. What is the most mind-blowing, what I call the what the fucks experience you've ever had in either any of your mediumship, healing, astral projection, just the biggest what the fuck.
Yeah, yeah. So this is kind of a tough one for me. I've had a number of experiences like that over the years. Some of them, some I'm not probably comfortable to share, and some I am. In part, one of the reasons I'm not comfortable to share some of them is because I'm still trying to understand what they were, what happened to me, um, and probably require a lot more context than we have time for here. But just to kind of like describe a few, I've had in meditation, I've had non-dual experiences, or what people might describe as like non-duality related experiences. I had one a few years ago where I was actually staying with some family in Jackson Beach, in Florida, and I essentially I was doing some meditation, and then all of a sudden I felt this very large presence, and it felt to me like there was an intelligence there. So I wasn't sure if it was a being or just like with a lot of presence or something, but I felt this enormous amount of energy go through my crown and down through my body. And as it did, I kind of had this like enormous blissful state that was kind of ineffable. I couldn't really describe it, but I also felt a connection to reality I've never felt before. And maybe I'd felt components of it in some other meditations, but I never felt it like this. And actually, as it kind of came down, it felt like it was moving through my chakras, was my perception, and it came down to my chest. And then it was too overwhelming, and I began to cry. And it showed me very clearly that I was not able to be a container or contain this amount or level of energy yet. That was sort of the idea that kind of came to me. But it's like, hey, you can't hold this because of what's going on in your heart chakra. So my takeaway from that was that I could, if I healed my heart chakra more, expanded it more, I could essentially bring in more energy and be able to potentially serve others better, was kind of the sense that kind of came to me. But the state was, it's a little bit like where your subject object relationship to reality is modified, and it's very noticeable, and you're in a state where you feel connected to all things, like everything in my environment, people around me. I mean, it didn't last that long, Liz, but it was really amazing. And I thought, wow, it reminds me some of the descriptions I've read from, Yogananda and other yogis, especially those that, came over to the West, describing things like samadhi or states like that. There's a lot of different types of states here. So it's a much bigger discussion, but in different kinds of non-dual states. But for me, that was a pretty profound one. I also think my first out of body experience where I saw my body was definitely a what the fuck moment. That was like, and that actually I was about 19, and I'm saying about because I might have been 18, but I'm pretty sure I was 19. I'll have to check my notes, but I went to bed, fell asleep. And I was at that moment starting to experiment, like, oh, maybe I could have an out of body experience. I could provoke this at will or whatever. I wasn't really sure. And at the time, I was reading Rene Descartes, and I was a philosophy student, so I was pretty deep into thinking about the nature of reality, and that probably helped me. And then what happened was I woke up like standing up, which was confusing. Like I was like, kind of like as if you're opening your eyes, and you're like, for a moment, I didn't look to the left or right in the beginning. I kind of just opened my eyes and was like, what the hell is going on here? Like, why am I awake here? Standing, like, did I fall asleep and then sleepwalk and wake up? I was trying to figure that out very quickly in my mind. And then I turned around to my left and I saw my physical body on the bed. And that was shocking. It was because I felt fully awake as I am right now talking to you. So for me, that was a full lucid out of body experience. And when I saw my body in the bed, that was pretty shocking because I had never experienced it before. And I think at that time I had heard about experiences like that, but for me, it was nothing that I could have read could have prepared me 100% for what that was like. The nature of the experience too changed me. I had like a kind of a sense that like I'm more closer to home here, or something, like I'm connected to something here, and also had like a loss of fear of my fear of death, which kind of vanished, I think, upon that experience. And so there was kind of just like a knowing and like a sense of like, I'm not afraid because of it's like, oh yeah, that's it, that's right. There's some kind of like a returning to a sense of knowing and understanding that was hard for me to describe. That felt very innate, but I could not really explain logically. But the experience brought that to me, and then over time, as I had more out of body experiences, that also my connection and my perception of reality changed slowly over time. But so that was another, I would say, a big, what the fuck moment. So.
And when you were out of body, did it feel as physical as being in a body? Like, does it feel different than?
Yes,
Like
for me in that experience, it did. It felt like I was in another physical body. Like my other experiences later on were not all like that. I had many like that, but they weren't all like that. But that particular one, like imagine like the way you feel right now in your physical body, or like for the listeners of the show here, like the way you feel in your body as you're listening to this podcast, and you kind of have like a sense of time of going by, of a sense of self. There's a sense of awareness you have. Just imagine that being the same thing, but now in some other dimension or some other reality, to the point where I was confused. I thought I was awake, and then I realized I wasn't awake. I was having an out-of-body experience. And so, yeah, that for me was life changing, and so, yeah, so those are a couple experiences that come to mind. There's some unusual ones from other areas that also were maybe different kinds of like what the fuck moments. Like, when I was healing a client, I had a very clear clairvoyant perception of some kind of small being mixing colors of energy while they were working on his stomach area during a healing session that I was doing. And that was kind of like, whoa, what is, just to see the mechanism going on kind of non-physically, which doesn't happen to me in many of my healing sessions. That was kind of profound. And that happened in the past year or so. And actually that client, after that, I think it was after that session, or it might have been a session around that time, no longer needed a catheter that he had for many, many years. He could completely get rid of the catheter. And this is an older fellow, by the way. So, yeah, I have a number of experiences like that.
Now you're talking about perceiving these other beings, such as, the man who was healed by a being. And see, how do they align, or do they, or match up with the beings you perceive while you're doing mediumship reading, which I assume are recently or fairly recently deceased humans or animals?
Yeah, so when I'm doing my mediumship work, I'm doing mental mediumship, or what might be described as mental mediumship, say in research in the space. And so I am acting as an intermediary, and I'm perceiving communications coming to me. There's kind of like a process of sorting, like, let's say my thoughts are red marbles and their thoughts are white marbles, and I'm kind of separating that in the process to kind of remove my mind and just bring through information coming through from them. So that experience for me is often kind of telepathic in nature. It's sort of more, I'm perceiving ideas, and then in many cases emotions as well coming through, or a sense of things, kind of like an intuitive sort of knowing that's hard to describe. Or people might put in the category of like claircognizance, like where you just kind of have a knowing about something, and that can also be part of the communication. And so, yeah, in my healing experiences, I'm in a trance state. And so I'm not as awake. I'm a little bit in a different kind of trance state than the state that I'm in when I'm doing readings, I should clarify. So I feel like I'm a little bit like less awake, and I'm actually focused on making a connection with healing guides, or spirit helpers that are helping that healing process. And so it's kind of a different state. So I don't notice as much when I'm doing healing sessions. I sometimes will have these kind of clairvoyant perceptions like the one I just shared. But I wouldn't say they're very common, because actually the moment I'm starting to focus on those things, it actually interrupts the healing process and the link with my healing guides. So at least for me, it does. So I try to minimize that. Sometimes they'll bring me out of trance to show me something, and I think that might have happened in that particular example.
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened.
In those examples in healing, I've had visual perceptions, and sometimes I've received information. And the way I've received information in the healing session, from a guide is similar, very, very similar, pretty much the same as what I experienced in one of my psychic mediumship reading sessions. Now, in terms of astral projection or out of body experiences, that can differ quite a bit because they're just like I was describing. I've experienced myself in many out of body experiences where I'm in that dimension. I have a sense of presence. I seem to have what appears to be an astral body, or what people would call an astral body or an etheric double or something. And I don't know, by the way, also, or I'm not sure. I'm saying again, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I'm actually not sure if the astral body is really a real thing or a construct of consciousness. Of course, everything could be a construct, but I've had a lot of experiences with it. Not all of my experiences are with it. And in those experiences, if I encounter someone else, they often seem to be embodied also in some kind of other body or vehicle in the nature of the astral projection. But I've also encountered intelligences that had no sort of form. They had no astral body, no silhouette, or maybe no physical appearing representation within the out-of-body experience itself. And it's just more like an intelligence kind of coming down. Maybe I've seen, in some cases, they may have a representation like a point of light or something like this. But in some cases, I don't see anything visual, but then I can feel when they connect with me in the out-of-body experience. And those experiences, I would say they're kind of, when they're lucid, they're more direct. And, it's almost like there's no mistaking your thoughts for their thoughts as much, I feel like, as we might experience as mediums when we're working in that process. Of course, as you become a trained medium, you get better at separating your thoughts from their thoughts and any interference from your energy in the process. But I feel like in out-of-body experiences, assuming you're having a lucid one, okay, because if you're not having a lucid one, then you could be interfering with the experience. And unfortunately, there's a lot of those that people can have, especially on your way to developing them. Where it's like, you wake up outside the body, but you're kind of groggy, or something is not very clear, and you have dream images or oniric images mixing in with the experience. And then it becomes less trustworthy because you could have an experience that you're actually influencing, and what you think is, an actual astral object, for example, or something in the out-of-body experience is actually just a dream image, typical of maybe irregular dreams, right? If we're kind of differentiating those types of experiences. So yeah, let me know, Liz, if that kind of clarifies that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, as much as we can understand this, I just do have two questions. So you said sometimes while you're astral projecting, you encountered other embodied beings who are also astral projecting, and some beings that you think are absolutely not embodied. So first, about the embodied, do you think they're humans on Earth, or are they other intelligent material beings on other planets?
I think they could be both. Yeah, if they're embodied, it could be people that are just projected who live on planet Earth in our space time and have some kind of physical body, in this dimension, if you will. And then they're just projected outside of the body. I think ultimately, if you're seeing somebody with like an astral body or some kind of embodiment, and they're in some kind of astral dimension, to use this term, or some other non-physical dimension, right? The way I see it is you're kind of consciousness perceiving, interpreting energy. And so you're seeing them represented that way. And maybe they're also seeing themselves represented that way, which will make the representation even stronger. But it doesn't mean that everybody who has an out-of-body experience will appear that way if another projector were to see them. That kind of depends on the nature of the experience. And I do know people that have had out-of-body experiences where some people will sometimes, depending on some theories that you find in the astral projection out-of-body experience space on the practitioner side, some people will have a theory that you could have an out-of-body experience like in your mental body, or what like theosophists or occultists might call the mental body, right? Some of these more esoteric terms from various historical traditions. And then in that case, you may not appear to have a body. You could be a point in space or something like this. There are numerous experiences I've heard from both practitioners and I've read about that are like that. And so in those cases, maybe you might appear differently to someone else. So I just kind of want to clarify that. I do think, but people that have crossed over, can have what appears to be a body as well, or an astral body, right, or this kind of energetic body of some sort. Um, and that can appear very similar to another projector. I don't have that many experiences where I've met another projector and I was able to kind of verify and confirm that um, in a veridical fashion, but I've had enough that I know that from experience, and I also know that from just talking to um, friends and colleagues that are kind of in that space. That
Wait,
also.
you have had a few vertical or no vertical? If you've had a
Um,
vertical, I'd love you to share it.
yeah, so I've had experiences, so vertical in this sense, Liz, like where you meet somebody outside of the body and you recount, let's say you have a conversation, you recount that conversation, and then when you talk to the person the next day, they remember that in detail, like
Yeah.
to a T. So I've
That's amazing. That
yeah,
is
yeah.
amazing.
Unfortunately, it wasn't under like controlled research conditions or anything like that. So it's just based on our anecdotal reports. But yeah, no, for me, those are experiences that I think are pretty mind blowing, even if you've had out of body experiences, because they're just not very common. And I think when you have something sync up like that, it's fascinating because you can kind of like the sort of the realness of the experience when you wake up back in the physical dimension and you're here processing it. It's like, wow, this is really, there is, a vertical and aspect to this. There's kind of an objective aspect to these experiences that carries over into this dimension. So, and there's a lot of out of body experiences you can have where you can't confirm that. And we see this a lot in the space, by the way, especially sort of like in the new age space, people reporting experiences where it's like, yeah, I don't know, connected to this ascended master and this kind of thing happened or whatever. And that could be an experience that's actually happening, but then we don't have anything to confirm that. And so, yeah, the experiences where you can confirm it can be really, really awesome, to have. I've had that happen with some personal friends. For now, Liz, I'll share just that amount because maybe I should check with some people before if I share more details. But yeah, but the nature of those experiences was essentially having a conversation or some kind of communication going on. Also, in those experiences, those out of body experiences, the recall of the experiences, it doesn't always match 100%. I find also because they might be perceiving me from a different angle, so just from that aspect, but it could also be because maybe it's a little bit like our memories could be a little fuzzy. It's like, okay, let's say if I said a sentence, or I remember saying a sentence, and they remember me mentioning this topic, but they don't remember those exact words. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So it's of course it'd be nice to have a perfect match where we just wake up, record the experience, and it matches exactly. But I haven't had one exactly like that yet.
I haven't even had that with here in this dimension. People remember different things and notice different things. So that I always find a little encouraging. So
Yes. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
You might remember the basics, but one person will be like, oh, remember that woman said that thing, and I'll remember something else. And you kind of
totally. And there's a lot in the way, right? Just the recall and the process of of communicating it too and all that. So yeah.
And also, I'm going to edit this out, but it's now 45 minutes. I really want to get into the history. So let's do that. And then I'll touch base when we're done with that just to see if we're done or if, there's something you really want to make sure I cover. So you are incredibly educated in the history of mediumship and parapsychology.
Mm-hmm.
I have so many questions about this. First of all, what are some of the amazing studies and research that really stands out to you from back in the past?
Yeah, so looking at the overall field of, let's say, investigation into psychic phenomena or psi research, there's so much there, Liz. So it'd be hard for me to really say, okay, any one thing here, or let's say these experiments were much more important than everything else. But there are some, key researchers and then bodies of work that kind of stand out. I mean, and I probably think most people in the field would probably agree with this. Like, for example, if we go back to let's say J.B. Rhine, who you might be familiar with, he was a parapsychologist, and he really was kind of the father of modern parapsychology. And before him, it tended to be referred to as psychical research. He modernized the field by bringing in modern developments at the time, around, for example, like psychology and academic research into the space, and kind of formalize the research in a way that made it more serious, and potentially could test things in a more reliable fashion using statistical methods that were being developed at the time, and things like this. And before then, you had a lot of people that were investigating psychic phenomena kind of sort of as like lone investigators, or sometimes in groups, where they were tending to investigate things like mediums, and they might test things like telepathy or aspects like that in let's say seances, which are quite popular going back in time, just due to the fact that spiritualism as a religion or a philosophy was quite popular. If we go back to back in U.S. history, and also in the history of Europe. And that was kind of a tradition that had a lot of mediums. It was kind of part of the practice and the tenets of spiritualism, which is that some of us have mediumship capabilities, and are allowed, or are capable of bringing through information from the other side, and by doing so we help others. So spiritualism kind of has a series of tenets and beliefs, and as it grew in popularity, so did the number of mediums that were working in that space. And at its height, or periods, where I'm going to say, like, I don't know if we know the exact point in time where spiritualism, for example, in the United States was at its height, but I would say, like, let's say in the second half of the 1800s, especially as we go into like the 1870s, 1880s, going up to like the 1920s, spiritualism was quite large, right, with like millions and millions of followers. So there was a big amount of like psychical research or psi research at that time that was taking place around that whole phenomena of mediums, right? I think when you get to J.B. Ryan is when you get what we have is more the modern field, where we're using things like statistical methods to see if somebody can, like, looking at, for example, Zener cards, those cards with different symbols on them. J.B. Ryan had developed those, and did research studies with those, with various people. And if you look at his experiments, like the Pratt Woodruff experiments, where he's having people trying to see what those cards are from a distance, or things like this, those are really phenomenal. They were groundbreaking, and it kind of, in a way, set the tone for the field for years and decades to come, in terms of further separating the experimenter from what was being studied. Because in a lot of like the mediumship research before that, you had people that were sitting in seances, right? And they would sometimes grow close to these mediums, and there was possibilities, of course, of fraud and things like this. And it's not the same thing as statistically analyzing whether somebody can guess a dice number, right, over and over like 10,000 trials. So there's something about that that's quite a bit stronger. So that's kind of he's a researcher that definitely stands out, and a key moment there. I also think there, some of the other researchers who have crossed over, like Charles Honorton, and the development of the Gansfeld experiments. That was like a big development, in my opinion, for the field, because the psi effect that could be gained from that was quite high. And even after, Charles Honorton went back and forth with Ray Hyman, and there was some, dialoguing going on there between researchers and some skeptics, and refining the controls around the experiments, et cetera. Even after doing that, the results were really quite strong. So that's another kind of breakthrough kind of time period to me in psi research. And then we have things like the development of remote viewing, the remote viewing protocol, right? So you're probably familiar with that. So those are all kind of areas that stand out. I kind of feel like, if we were to go back to its origins, we could go back to, I'd have to check, but I believe it's like, maybe going 1600s is when we have people beginning to investigate some of these kinds of claims, at least maybe in the more modern sense, because we obviously don't have certain records if we go to ancient periods of time of people conducting investigations. Maybe they did, but maybe somebody was investigating oracles in ancient Greece, but I don't know of any records of that. So it's kind of also based on our historical records of these kinds of things. But I think when you really get to, it really begins, right? Like, going in the the 19th century into the 20th century. This is really, and really we have, lot of people will say we have like about 120 years of, modern parapsychology and data, roughly. But the overall investigation goes much further back, right? So where we have individual scientists, or maybe investigating some claim or something like that. So, um,
And now, one thing that was really investigated quite frequently back then with
mhm,
seemingly positive results was physical mediumship.
mhm,
And for our listeners, some of you don't know, that's like seances where a medium will, move objects, manifest voices out of thin air. And so, there's a lot more to
yeah,
it than that. I have attended with one, which was very clearly absolutely complete fraud. And I covered that in my first book, but
mhm.
they were getting so much apparently. And you hear of almost none today aside from possibly Stuart Alexander. What are your thoughts on that? Why has
Yeah.
physical mediumship diminished so much? And do you think it's real in the first place, or do you think it was all fraud and our techniques have just gotten better?
Yeah, so I do think that some of it is real. This is kind of, based on if I'm looking at like historical research, that's kind of my assessment from some of the historical research. But I also think there probably was a high degree of fraud also. So I think the answer to this, Liz, is kind of multifold. I think there's several different reasons as to why it's so rare now compared to where it was historically. One of them has to do with what I just mentioned. So the aspect of fraud, right? If we look back, and I'll kind of go through these maybe in no particular order, and I think all of them kind of weigh into our current situation. The first thing is, um, even if we suppose that there were large amounts of physical mediumship that actually were real, right? Let's say they were genuine phenomena and they were not fraudulent. The one issue or one problem with this space is that area of psi investigation historically was very, very controversial. There were a lot of very qualified researchers in the history of parapsychology and psychical research when we go further back that essentially concluded they believed in like maybe mental mediumship. Like if you take like a researcher like James Hislop, um, investigating Leonora Piper, or lots of other researchers that were investigating mediums, many of them could come to the point where they thought there was enough evidence for like mental mediumship. But physical mediumship, due to kind of probably in part of how radical it is in one sense, the fact that we have like physical phenomena appearing, and the fact that it was so controversial, many of them took, to me, in my opinion, and from my readings, like positions that were maybe naturally a little bit more skeptical to that kind of phenomena. And we could say that maybe that was justified, because if someone, right, is claiming something that could be highly unusual, right, we're going to probably approach that differently than something that is not. Although there are arguments against that idea, right? Because there's a kind of that notion that you find of like, okay, so um, the like, forgetting at the moment who said this, but the more outrageous the claim, sort of like the more
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Carl Sagan. I say it,
yes,
and I quote him on that all the time.
yes. And so, there are some arguments philosophically against that, but I can understand in practice why researchers in history tended to follow that and be more skeptical to physical mediumship claims. And so, on in one sense, we have like an area that's just kind of more complex, and I'm not sure that there was always clearly agreed upon criteria to kind of measure and test physical mediumship. A lot of researchers criticized other researchers in history that this could have been done, this could have been fraudulent. So there's a tendency to just be like, okay, since we don't have anything very, very solid, or we could always find ways in which the medium was acting fraudulently to produce these phenomena, then we're just going to kind of dismiss the space, or we're not going to take it as seriously, right? So there's a very human element to the research investigation into this. And also I see kind of almost like a selective hyper skepticism to this space as well by skeptics. Because if physical mediumship is real, it's now we're going beyond just right something that's like maybe telepathic happening in someone's mind, to something that could be hard, in a hardcore fashion, verifying like the reality of the non-physical world. by the fact that we're having these like materializations appear. And so I see kind of like it's a little bit like the moving the goalpost phenomena. People start to go, okay, so well, the evidence has to be like this, right? Okay, we got that. We got that evidence. No, now it has to be like this, right? So it's just fraught with controversy and people that both that I would say were honest, well-intentioned researchers that were open-minded, as well as skeptics in the skeptic communities at the time, or in the group of people we describe as being skeptics. That between both groups, we just find them tending to there's going to be a tendency to just discredit the mediums if they can find something. The other thing I think that makes this complex too is there has been an argument, and this is going actually way back to Sir Oliver Lodge and some other individuals who were partaking in investigations in physical mediumship, which is that some of the people investigating could have been affecting the phenomena. So if I'm highly skeptical and my energy field is emitting this highly skeptical kind of attitude towards physical mediumship, there's the idea that this could influence the physical mediumship itself, or cause certain things to appear like they're fraud, right? And this reminds me a little bit like the experimenter effect, that we have in modern parapsychology, where we know that the experimenter can have an effect on the experiment itself. And it's really tricky when we bring this into things like physical mediumship, right? Because now we have another variable to kind of account for that. So I think that just when you read the history of physical mediumship, I think a lot of people look at all the challenges, they look at all the skepticism, or of course, if you're looking at Wikipedia, you're going to be getting a skeptical, view of this phenomena due to the guerrilla skeptics and all the people editing those kinds of articles. But a lot of people will just look at that and just go, okay, there's so much here that's controversial, or I can't tell what's going on, so I'm just going to dismiss the space. And so that in and of itself makes people less interested in the space, I think, or just not take it as seriously. I also think there's a lot to lose for people that want to become physical mediums or develop physical mediumship, including researchers that want to investigate the phenomena, because it's a little bit like you're poking the skeptic's bear, so to speak, and you might be inviting unwanted attention, into a very controversial area. And so I think those factors weigh in. I also have something that's kind of historically based, just on population and availability of mediums, Liz, which is if we look at the heyday of physical mediumship, or you look at its correlation with, let's say, the development of like spiritualism, where a lot of these mediums came from or were connected with. So if we look at, for example, like D.D. Hume, the famous physical medium, or we look at ones that are not as well known but are also pretty famous, like Jack Weber, like if you're knowledgeable of the field, right? Mediums that exhibited physical mediumship, some were tested, some were not. They were oftentimes finding out about their mediumship by attending a seance or a mediumship development circle. Like in Jack Weber's case, that happened. Where he attended a circle to actually be with somebody, or I think this was like near his girlfriend. I don't even know if he took it seriously. And then he found out he had these abilities. And so, like in that case, we have a much higher indirect recruitment of people that could potentially be physical mediums. And actually now we have much less of this. We just don't have that many people going into development circles or in seances or some sort of event of some sort where they can discover that they have that possibility. So the pool of available actual physical mediums is probably much smaller, I think, also. And that could be about mediumship in general, too. And so if you keep on checking thousands and thousands of people, you're probably going to find some Michael Jordans, right? So that's kind of the way I sort of see it. So, and that would have happened in history, but now we have a much smaller pool. The other thing about this too is that physical mediums, I do know some of people that claim to be physical mediums and, do practice, but I know of a very small amount that I consider to be potentially genuine, and I have not investigated them in any way that I can confirm that. But a person who's a physical medium today has a lot to lose, because we're in a very, open social media environment. They can be easily attacked by people of a religious orientation or by skeptics. And so that's what in part I meant by there's a lot to lose, right? So there's a pressure there, whether that's direct or indirect. And so I've heard also I heard a story through some friends that I trust in the mediumship space, some who are professional mediums themselves, of people that exhibited physical mediumship and then got harmed in the process. One of them like ended up in the hospital, and a story I can't share in full detail because I have to get all the details here from my friends and check on that. But it seems to have a danger associated with it, that maybe we have to understand a bit more. But also that's been reported throughout history, and that person stopped trying to do any kind of physical mediumship after that particular session. And so, yeah, as we can see, there's a number of factors that kind of would push people away from it or make it more difficult. And it's just more rare, I think, amongst people. We're going to have people that are much more capable of mental mediumship than they would of physical mediumship, even if we're just looking at the numbers historically from, psi research connected to spiritualism, in the past.
Have you personally ever witnessed any form of physical mediumship?
Yeah, so I have, I attended a couple of seances with a physical medium, and perceived what seemed to be physical phenomena. And I went into it quite skeptically, frankly, because of all my reading about it historically, I naturally kind of had a skeptical mind a little bit about it. I'm like, okay, well, I could see a lot of opportunities for fraud, as many skeptics and investigators have found. And so when I went into it, I couldn't say my expectations were high in any sense. I don't know. Overall, I was impressed by what I saw. I do think that some of the phenomena appear genuine. There's no way for me to 100% know without us obviously doing some extensive testing. So again, if you're just attending it as an attendee to a seance where someone's claiming that, you're going to just be left to your own devices, right? Like trying to figure out, is this real, is this not, et cetera. And that's not going to be adequate to, conclusively know 100%, right? Or maybe we never know 100%, but in a more rigorous fashion, whether that phenomena is real. But I do think the intentions of the medium were very positive and genuine, and I was impressed, with the experience. But I'm not an expert in evaluating from a scientific standpoint, whether it's real or not. And so I'm not going to go any further than that. We'll just say those are just my subjective impressions. And it was a very interesting experience. Yeah.
As we're winding down, I have one final question. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have biases, either super believy or absolutely like there's no way this is possible at all. How can people experience self-deception or bias in their psychic experiences, either if they're having them themselves, mm-hmm. or if they're researching, or if they're getting a reading?
The first thing is, I'm going to just say, I think in my personal opinion, I think it's possible for you to have a psychic or spiritual experience, and come to incorrect conclusions about what it is you're perceiving or what is actually going on, right? Now, that might be sort of obvious to some people, but I've noticed in the space, there's a tendency for people when they have these kinds of experiences to want to attach to this sort of like immediate impression of what they think was happening, right? So let's just say if I'm meditating and I'm trying to connect with a deceased loved one, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to connect to, let's say, my dad who's passed away, or something like this. I'll say an example here. Let's say, pretend my father has passed away and I want to connect with him. People will, maybe do some kind of meditation or some kind of practice, and then maybe see if there's a response, and they might get some information and wonder, okay, I think this is him kind of coming through, or, oh, wow, that must be him, right? And will want to, or have a tendency to, and this is connected to like confirmation bias and also other certain cognitive biases in modern psychology, will have a tendency to want to confirm that which we're kind of intending to do or get to. So it's like, okay, maybe I don't have any evidence that my dad's coming through, but I actually think that, well, okay, it seems like he could give me those kinds of thoughts, and I could have this kind of experience, so it must be him, right? I think it's important for us to look at the process by which we come to those conclusions. And I find it interesting because a lot of people will come to sometimes very strong conclusions about their experiences without having properly gone through a process of maybe testing things a little bit more in their own personal experience, or just questioning, or sometimes suspending judgment on something. I think in the example that I'm giving, for example, in this case, I would say, like, you'd have to reality test that a bit, right? Like, okay, so if this is my dad, then okay, answer this question, right? um, and can you show me something maybe I don't know, but you could confirm, or something like that, right? So these would be kind of experiments you could kind of do. I see there's kind of a tendency to kind of want to just like what you see is what you get. It's like, okay, so I had this experience, and then people will jump to that kind of conclusion that it must have been a spirit or it must have been this, because people are wanting to have these experiences. So there's this kind of dangerous tendency to just kind of jump into the boat that, hey, oh yeah, I must have had the experience. If I'm going to choose between this having been real or not been real, and I can't kind of tell and it's sort of fuzzy, instead of suspending judgment, I'll just jump into the idea that this is probably real, right? But I think that sometimes this happens, Liz, in a way that's kind of unconscious. I don't think people always mean to do that in a conscious sense, but probably most of the time it's unconscious. But we know with cognitive biases in psychology, and we know from numerous experiments with cognitive bias, that it's something that is found amongst people across cultures all around the world. And we also know that it's something that can be replicated quite well, especially certain kinds of cognitive bias, like confirmation bias or association bias or things like this. So I think it's also important to be aware that this could take place in the interpretation of your psychic and spiritual experiences. So you kind of have to come up with a process or some kind of qualification process, we could maybe say, for your own experiences. I think that's important. A lot of times we have that kind of implicitly or unconsciously, but it's good to think about this, in a conscious way, not just kind of like, okay, yeah, I've got my, system which I'll determine if this is real or not, but to kind of think about what your system is and why are you coming to that conclusion, right? The act of questioning that sometimes allows us to kind of go a little bit deeper inside of ourselves in our personal development. And sometimes we can find things connected to our psychology, or even maybe our shadow elements or unconscious elements of our psychology, like our desire for approval, or our desire to feel special, or our desire to stand out, or our desire to kind of have something like some special knowledge that other people don't have. All of these things can weigh into the interpretations of these experiences negatively, and so I think it's important to look into that in each of our personal situations.
This has been really fascinating. You have such a depth of knowledge on these topics, so I really appreciate your coming on and sharing your research, knowledge, and experiences.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz.
Where can our listeners find you, follow you?
So at the moment, I'm not on social media at the moment, but I plan to kind of go into social media fairly soon. But the best way to kind of get in touch with me is to check out my website and subscribe to my email list. And you can find that by going to the first page and scrolling to the bottom. And on my email list, I'll be issuing information around things like, podcasts like this, or workshops and courses I'm doing. I'm actually going to be launching more workshops and courses, both online and in person locally here in Colorado. I live in Longmont, Colorado. I'm near Boulder, kind of in the Boulder area, Boulder, Denver area, I should say. And so I will have events in kind of this region as well as online. So yeah, so those are ones you can kind of check out. And I also, of course, give readings on a regular basis, and I see healing clients, and I do coaching also with people, which is more longer term for bigger transformation processes. Yeah.
Amazing. And I'll put the link to your website in the show notes, but what is it called?
So it's just GabrielSereni.com. And if you go there, you'll find, information on my courses. I'm going to be updating it shortly, so you might see some changes from now until when you go there. But yeah.
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?